Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Richard Gearhart. You're watching a special edition of KSBY News on Facebook. This is called Beyond the Headlines, where we will be talking in depth about some of the issues surrounding the Kristen Smart murder trial. We want to take you beyond the daily reporting and dig deeper into some of those issues surrounding the trial. This case is complex, more than 26 years in the making, and there is a lot to talk about. So to get you caught up to speed first on what has happened so far this week in court. There was no court on Monday due to an absent juror. On Tuesday, the defense for Paul and Ruben Flores rested their case. Before resting, the defense called former San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Detective Henry Stewart to the stand. Stewart said that in 2001, he worked with the FBI to conduct an undercover investigation in an effort to get a confession from Paul Flores. Next on the stand was Sheriff's Detective Clint Cole. Cole testified that he inherited several hundred documents in relation to the Kristen Smart case when he took over in 2017. Cole was asked about a Facebook page called Justice for Kristen Smart. Cole said he follows the page and added that he was concerned the page could jeopardize the investigation, confirming the page was dedicated to convicting Paul of Kristen's murder. After Cole's testimony, the defense rested its case. Court was dark on Wednesday. Today, the prosecution called DNA analyst Angela Butler back to the stand as a rebuttal witness. She was questioned more about the soil samples that she tested for blood. Also today, the judge questioned one of the jurors about her Pinterest page that included things such as how to test soil pH without a kit. The juror said she was having trouble getting things to grow in her yard. The attorney for Paul Flores requested the juror be removed, but the judge ruled that that juror could stay. Closing arguments are scheduled to begin next week. So with that, I would like to welcome my guest tonight, John Trice. And John is a retired San Luis Obispo Superior Court judge. And not his first time being on the show. And the reason I called you back is lots has happened. And, I felt like we weren't quite done chatting last time around. And because of some of these issues that have cropped up, and we just talked about a couple of them with the jurors, and I wanted to get your take on that. Sure. The trial's been going on for so long. We've had multiple juror kind of problems crop up. And the judge, as part of the court proceedings, we're allowed to stay in for any of the open part of the court or on record part of the court, even though the jurors are dismissed. The jurors will be called back in to kind of address some of these issues. One of them was a juror that's been sort of consistently late to court, and they keep admonishing him, as they say, to get there on time. He was the absent juror that made court go dark for the entire day. How common are these jury problems cropping up during trials?
I think it's pretty unusual to have a juror consistently late like that, particularly in a case where the logistics are so difficult. As you're well aware, there's two separate juries. You've got 24 people just to start, and then I think they each had 8 or 10 alternates. That's a lot of people to sort of corral every single day. And if you've got somebody that's consistently late, you're just, in my opinion, asking for trouble. I was quite frankly sort of surprised that the judge at some point, particularly late in the trial where you have 3 or 4 alternates left, hasn't dismissed that person. But I guess it's gone well so far, but it's...
Yeah, she talks about her reasons. Obviously, she has to talk to the other attorneys about it, and she says that he has shown improvement over time, et cetera. We've had a couple of other issues crop up though that I think are just personally, and some of this is just my personal opinion. I'm watching the trial and learning as we go. One of the jurors actually had a conversation. So the witness, a defense witness, was on the stand. Everybody went to lunch. They came back from lunch, and he was sitting outside the courtroom waiting to go back on the stand. And the jurors were returning from lunch as well, and they struck up a conversation. Obviously, after the judge reminds them every single time not to talk about the case. Right. How serious of an infraction is that? And that juror is still on the case as well.
Yeah. It's difficult, particularly going back to what we just talked about, when you have that many jurors and alternates walking around and you have a relatively small area or waiting area outside the courtroom. Sometimes the jurors won't even know if a person is there that they're actually a witness or a potential witness. That particular situation, since they knew the person was a witness who was going back on the stand, it's very unusual. I wasn't there, so I don't know how it eventually worked out. I'm assuming hopefully it was just some type of casual conversation about the weather or sports.
Yeah, it was about they were from a similar area. The witness actually is working in Hawaii, and she's from a similar area. So it was like and they called them both in individually. Right. They had the exact same story about the conversation. The conversation was short. The witness cut it off. I mean, it wasn't a big deal. It sounds like I guess it's one of those media things, right? Where like we could make it sound like it's a bigger deal than it was. And obviously the judge's discretion is involved in deciding these things, right?
Yeah, and the judge has to. when that's brought to his or her attention, the judge has to bring in the parties and figure out exactly what happened. So it's sort of time consuming. And as I used to say, 9 times out of 10, they're talking about the weather or sports or something like that. But it takes away from the trial, it delays everything. And it's, people are people, and we're all relatively friendly, and so it's not unusual to have that happen. But when it happens, you have to take time away from the trial to deal with it.
I wonder, the other thing that I was kind of thinking about in court is I wonder how much of these discussions that they have are almost kind of automatic in court, right? So one of the jurors wrote a note to the judge, complained about one of the defense attorneys being a little too aggressive in questioning, thought he was being kind of mean to the witnesses the prosecution was calling. And so, of course, he's going to move that juror be excused. Right. Obviously, the DA, the prosecutor, moved the juror who had the conversation with the defense witness. Don't you almost have to make that case as an attorney?
Yeah, and it's difficult when you're an attorney, whether obviously a defense attorney or a prosecutor. You want to get aggressive with certain kinds of witnesses, but you got to be very careful when you're doing that because, I think last time you and I talked, you're trying to sell a position as an attorney, and if the jury doesn't like the messenger, they're not going to like the message. And so there's a fine line there. You don't want to alienate the jury against you, the lawyer, and then subsequently against your client. So I've had that happen before, where a juror say, this lawyer is really irritating me. I don't like what he or she is doing. I don't like this lawyer. But ultimately the question is, setting that aside, it's important that you not hold anything the lawyer says or does against the client. I want to make sure that you can be fair to the client. And so I'm assuming that was the conversation that was had, and the judge was convinced that the person at least indicated they could still be fair to both sides.
So a lot of what's happened in the more recent part of the trial has come down to, they've had these discussions about jury instructions, and then I've gotten a lot more documents recently that have been released. So a lot of the documents were sealed at the beginning of the trial, and over time there's been these motions from various media organizations, our organization joining on some of them, to release more and more of the documents. More have been coming out, so I'm able to sort of read what's been happening, all along. But it's more recently, while I've been watching these motions, it seems like a lot comes down to obviously the judge making the decisions, hearing from both sides. I mean, how much pressure is it, and what are some of the various reasons that trial verdicts get overturned?
Well, one of the biggest reasons cases get overturned, and it doesn't happen that often, but jury instructions are extremely important because that is what the judge has decided based on the input from both sides, what the law is going to be that the jurors have to hear and the jurors have to follow. And if the judge makes a mistake and later a court of appeals looks at that and said that instruction should not have been given, or the instruction that one side asked for or the other side asked for and wasn't given should have been given, that's one of the biggest reasons cases get overturned. That, and also juror misconduct, which is what you just mentioned a few minutes ago. So my opinion always was on the juror misconduct issue. If I ever got the feeling that somebody didn't want to be on the jury, I didn't want them on the jury. You're just asking for trouble. And so it looks so far that judge has a good reputation. It seems like she's done a great job. It's been sort of a monumental task to try to keep in line 2 separate juries of 12
plus
people.
plus the 8.
Right.
So I mean, just in courtroom space, like one of the things they do is week to week they actually flip-flop the jury. So the jury that sits in the actual jury box changes week to week.
Oh, really?
Do you think it makes that much of a difference? I mean, does it matter where you're sitting in the court?
I remember we talked about that last time you and I got together, and I had thought about it later, and I guess it comes down to something simple like, the closer you are to a witness and you can observe their behavior and how they react to different questions, it gives you a better idea how to judge someone's credibility. So it's actually not a bad idea. I had never done that because I'd never been in a situation where I had 2 separate juries with that many people. I mean, the biggest jury I ever had was 12 people and 8 alternates, and that was relatively manageable. So I think that's probably why she's flipping the people around.
And then for this part of the trial, I think this is where it's probably going to get confusing to some of our viewers, right? Because I mean, let's face it, most people, their knowledge of the courtroom probably comes from TV shows, right? And it seems like, you see the prosecution, you see the defense, you see the jury kind of go out, they come right back with the verdict. Can you kind of walk us through what is actually happening? I mean, some of those documents that were released today included proposed instructions, and it looks like those instructions come from a set source, and then there were some proposed modifications from the attorney. So tell us how the jury instructions are developed, and then really what happens, and we'll kind of work through like what's going to happen with the jury now that the case is kind of wrapping up.
Sure. So at the beginning of the trial, both sides, based on how they think the evidence is going to progress, submits proposed jury instructions. And the jury instructions are in books called CalCrim, California Criminal Jury Instructions, or in civil, it's a different set of books, and there's instructions on how to consider evidence, how to consider the credibility of witnesses. The more technical ones start to get into, for instance, in this case, I assume there's going to be instructions on first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, rape, attempted rape, and like I said, and the lesser included. So the judge has that at the very beginning, and then the judge, he or she, as the trial progresses, starts to figure out which instructions proposed by either side are relevant and which aren't. And then when you get to the very end, which they are now, you have a rather lengthy session, the lawyers and the judge, to figure out what are the instructions going to be that the judge is going to read to the jury. And so the judge hears from both sides, and then the judge eventually makes a decision. And what we did, I assume this judge is going to do the same, and you have your staff prepare a written packet. So each juror has their own packet of instructions. It'll probably be about 20 pages long. And based on those instructions, then the attorneys can craft their arguments to try to weave in the facts of the case to the instructions the judge is going to give. And then, as you're well aware, in a case like this, once the case goes to the jury, the verdict has to be unanimous, one way or the other. So in this case, obviously it's 12 out of 12 people have to agree either as to guilt or not guilty. If there's even one person that can't agree, then you end up with a hung jury. Then the district attorney's office would have to decide whether to start all over and try it again.
So if we're sort of at, and we're not, obviously we're not even in the deliberations, but that's kind of a question that's cropped up, right? So if you can't convince all 12 people to vote the same way, I've seen in prior court cases that I've covered, like they'll come back and they say, yeah, we can't reach a verdict, and the judge sort of talks to them a little bit and sends them back in. Like what kinds of things are you saying to the jury, and how are you kind of convincing them to kind of get to a unanimous decision?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not unusual. They'll go out and they'll take an initial vote or something like that, and maybe after a few hours they realize maybe it's 10-2 or 11-1 or whatever the divide is. And it's not unusual, particularly in some cases that have gone on for a long time, the jurors just want to get out of there.
Especially with this case that's been going on for months and months.
Right,
Yeah.
and so, but as a judge, almost any judge I've ever known, including myself, you're not going to let a jury give up after just a few hours, particularly in a case that's gone this long and both sides have so much invested. So if they say it looks like we're deadlocked, I would call the lawyers in, we would talk about the question. Maybe sometimes the jury would say, we'd like to hear this testimony reread, which can be done, or we'd like to have further instruction on this particular point or something like that. So anything the judge can do to try to keep the deliberations going is always the best interest of justice.
So will the judge actually ask the jurors, like, what is the hang-up? What is the problem? What are you guys discussing?
They will. Yeah, you can. I mean, the judge can do whatever he or she wants to do. It's sort of a delicate part of the case, however, because you don't want to, as a judge, push one way or the other. You want to make sure that you just try to focus on what they may need to help them in their deliberations.
And then kind of going back to that, like the judge seems to have this monumental job. I mean, I think you kind of watch TV, right? And you think, oh, the judge is sitting up there kind of making these little light decisions, but there's so much more that's going on behind the scenes. Like there's a bunch of evidence that is not necessarily allowed in the trial. Right. Like what are some of the reasons that some of this evidence wouldn't be included, and how are the judges making those decisions?
Well, the biggest decision sometimes the judge has to make about evidence is whether or not, well, first of all, it's got to be relevant. But sometimes, even though it's relevant, it's more prejudicial than really probative of anything. So in this particular case, I don't know all the ins and outs, but I know there were some allegations of prior sexual misconduct by Mr. Flores regarding some women, not only in San Luis Obispo County, but I think also in Southern California. And since he's charged with rape or attempted rape under the California Evidence Code, prior incidents of sexual assault can be brought in, but it's a real difficult decision for a judge to make on what should come in and what is relevant and what's too prejudicial, and takes the focus off actually what the jury's there to decide.
Yeah, and so in this particular case, a couple of the women who are alleging prior sexual assaults with him were allowed to testify.
Right.
Several were not.
Right.
So what's the difference between like, yeah, this person can and this person can't? I mean, what can make that difference? Obviously, you don't know in this case. But.
Yeah, I don't know in this particular case. I think there's a line in there somewhere where you may want to the judge may want to let some of that in because it's relevant, but on the other hand, you get into a trial within a trial and you start to lose the focus of what they're there to decide, because the only relevance something like that would have is if Mr. Flores has a propensity for that type of conduct. But you don't want to focus on all his prior conduct, you want to focus more on what the jury's there to decide.
So given these allegations, and there is, as far as my understanding is from documents were released recently, there's open investigations against him from LAPD. He can then be charged with those crimes separately than this trial, though,
right.
Regardless of the outcome of this trial.
Right, if the statute of limitations hasn't run. I'm not sure of the dates on those prior allegations, but it would have to still be within the statute of limitations. For murder, for instance, that he's on trial for now, there's no statute of limitations, whereas on other offenses it might be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, something like that.
So also getting back to that sort of prejudicial kinds of evidence, one of the things that came out in these documents that were released recently was that one of his attorneys early on, Mel De Lamont, who I'm sure you know, obviously from history, suggested, or supposedly, according to these documents, was in a negotiation as part of a plea deal and was willing to, quote unquote, show where the body was. And that evidence hasn't been allowed in, obviously, because the jury's going to say, hey, look, if he could have the ability to show where the body is, then that's obviously prejudicial, right? I mean, like what are we looking at in terms of when we can allow that kind of stuff in and when we can't?
Well, if it was Mr. Flores that said that would be one thing.
Yeah, he did not.
I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, so the question becomes, that's his lawyer, and the lawyer is making a certain representation. And so when can you allow a lawyer's representation to affect the client? And it's a very, very rare situation that can ever happen. So that's, I'm sure, what was the reason for her decision.
So then all these, all of this media coverage kinds of questions are popping up again too, and that in all states, as far as I know, but certainly in California, it's up to the judge, right? How much media coverage is allowed, or what types of cameras you allow into the courtroom, and what are some of the decision-making processes behind those?
I think that most of the time just comes down to the individual judge. I had a policy of trying to keep everything as open to the public as you possibly could. I think it's good for the system, it's good for the public. And so sometimes these decisions to not allow a camera or to not allow audio, I don't particularly support that. I'm sure this judge had to make that decision, and she made the decision she thought was in the best interest of the trial. But I think, I've always thought, the more open the process is, the better.
And so there was another second motion that was just heard today and denied by the judge, just to have at least the closing arguments open to the public, right? Because one of the cases, or I guess one of the things that she said early on was that she didn't want the jury to be exposed to too much media coverage. I mean, media coverage is going to happen whether there's cameras in the courtroom or not, right? But at the point where they get the instructions, there's less probability, right, of them actually seeing that played out on TV. She still said no, and that is completely up to the judge.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I mean, it was just like a still camera. So the judge is the last decision on that.
Absolutely.
In this state?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, if the judge doesn't want to let cameras in, they don't. If you'll notice, in most federal cases, they don't even allow cameras in the courtroom. Why, I don't know, but so I think it's most common in San Luis Obispo County to have cameras in the courtroom and have cameras during closing arguments. So for some reason, maybe the culture is a little different up in Monterey County. So.
Yeah, it was just kind of interesting. The other thing that kind of came out on this case, and I don't remember if we talked in depth about this last time, but one of the big issues with the podcast going on was whether or not the podcaster, Chris Lambert, was considered a journalist. Obviously, journalists have these extra protections under the California Shield Law from turning over evidence. And so there was a big question about, is he considered a journalist? Because that changes dramatically what happens during that podcast. And so how are judges able to sort of say, like, there's all these kind of little mini trials or mini cases within a case, right? And are you like going back and looking at case law? How are you making those decisions about these other exterior problems that are happening during a trial?
Well, when you're talking about, whether it's he or she is a journalist and whether there's a privilege or not, that's on a case-by-case basis. And there's very little case law in California on that issue. So the judge would have to hear who the person is, what their conduct was, what they've done with material that they've uncovered, and then make a decision. I mean, I thought clearly he was a journalist, even though he tried to say he wasn't, correct?
Right, yeah. Well, and that was kind of an issue that got brought up, right? Because in the podcast, he tried to say, I'm not a journalist,
Right.
I'm just giving out this information. But then when it came to, really what happened, and I did one of these interviews with him as well, and obviously I'm chatting with him in the courtroom, we're all sitting around, waiting during some of these breaks in the court. And he said, well, all of a sudden, he gets it with these things. He didn't know what was going to happen either, right? Like the attorneys want his notes, and they want different text messages that they send back and forth to these people that he's, that are all witnesses in the case. And he said, like, I felt like that was sort of getting in the way of my confidentiality that I'd established with these people who appeared on my podcast.
Right.
And so then an attorney came in and said, hey, we're going to argue that you're a journalist, you have these protections. And so, that was, again, the judge is deciding, if he comes around and says, I'm not a journalist, but then she's deciding, to allow him those special privileges. And also he wanted to sit in the courtroom, right? If you're going to be a witness in the trial and be subpoenaed, then you can't sit in the courtroom. Right. And so she quashed that subpoena, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
And so, again, those questions keep popping in my mind, like, how in the world do you figure that out as the judge? It all comes down to you, right?
Well, once you get into that situation, it gets sort of difficult because, the journalist may want to claim a privilege, but the journalist has interviewed some precipient witnesses, some relevant witnesses, and one of the most important things when someone testifies is what have they said in the past, what prior statements have they made, because prior statements, if they're consistent, can buoy the credibility of a witness. If they're inconsistent, they can attack the credibility of a witness. So the judge has got to decide, okay, even though there might be a claim of privilege, on the other hand, it may be outweighed by a defendant's right to confront a witness and against them.
So I got sidetracked there talking about all this media coverage because of something you said, but I want to get back to this, what actually happens in the jury room, because I think, and honestly, I don't even know, right?
You haven't been on a jury?
No, I've not. I've been called before, but they always excuse me. Something about the TV part, I guess. Yeah. When the jury actually goes into the room, like, what is the task in front of them? And do they start with the jury instructions? Obviously, they select a foreman. What is the actual process that happens during deliberation?
They can do pretty much anything they want to do. What the instructions say, the first thing you should do is choose a foreperson, and the foreperson will preside over the deliberations. It's easier, as I said earlier, if each of the jurors has their own set of instructions, so you don't have to have one copy floating around at everybody. And then, aside from that, it's up to them how they want to proceed. The jurors I've talked to over the years seem pretty consistent in saying they just start going around the table and getting an initial feel. Sometimes they'll take an initial vote even before they start discussing anything. But they're all expected to deliberate. In fact, if someone says, I've made my mind up, I'm not talking anymore about this, that's a refusal to deliberate, and if that's brought to the judge's attention, and I've seen this in cases I've done, the judge can actually excuse that juror as not following their oath to deliberate.
Okay, so there still can be some maneuvering.
Oh yeah, and another thing they can do is they can always ask for testimony to be reread, which seems like they always do. Yeah. We give them forms if they have a question about. They may only want one part of the testimony reread, or maybe they want an instruction clarified. What I used to try to get them to do is, if you want something reread, try to focus on exactly the portion of that testimony that you want reread. So if someone's on the stand for a day and all they want to know is what they saw at 5 p.m. in the parking lot, you don't want to have the court reporter go in there and read for a day just to get to one particular section.
And so what do they have access to? Do they have like access to the police reports to reread them, or just to the testimony and whatever's reread? So they're just talking about what they remember, their notes, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. In fact, that's probably the most common question. They will say, "We want a transcript of the whole trial." Well, no, you're not going to do that. Or, "We'd like to see the police reports that some of these people have been mentioning." A witness will say, "You know, I got there at 3 in the afternoon," and the lawyer will say, "Well, didn't you say in this police report that it was 4?" They'll bring it up that way. So then they want to see the police reports. But you don't let the police reports go in because that's called hearsay evidence. I mean, the value of a trial is you just don't give them a bunch of police reports and let them make a decision. The value of a trial is they sit there, they see the witness face to face, they can see how they are answering questions, what their demeanor is, and judge their credibility.
So a couple of questions. Number one, I posed this question early on, and I don't think I've ever kind of followed up or gotten the answer. Is there a situation, what would happen in a situation where, because the two jurors are deliberating separately, what if Ruben's jury says, yes, he was an accessory to the crime, but there was no crime because the other jury said no? What happens in that case?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I've actually been thinking about that myself. That would be sort of a nightmare, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And there have been cases like that in the United States. I've never seen it in my career, and I certainly hope it doesn't happen here where you get inconsistent verdicts like that. I think if you had inconsistent verdicts like that, there would probably be a motion for a new trial, which would probably be granted, because that would not make sense, would it?
Yeah, no, and like, you know, I think like the first person I asked that question was a retired prosecutor, you know, and she said, well, I don't think I know, you know, but it is not a situation where they'd only like reveal one.
No, I mean, it could possibly, I guess, make sense for the jury to decide that Paul Flores is responsible